All right, so now I'm going to cover the last chapter on bacterial pathogens, which is chapter 21. So I'll start off with the spirochetes. The three genera of bacteria that I will mention are Treponema, Leptospira, and Borrelia. So for Treponema, we see species within this genus living in the oral cavity, intestinal tract, and also the perigenital regions of humans and animals. And this is one genus of bacteria that, similar to viruses, actually requires live cells in order to culture it in the lab. Now, one that is important with regards to medical significance is Treponema pallidum. This is the causative agent of the STD syphilis. So this particular microbe cannot survive very long outside of the host. It is sexually transmitted and also passed transplacentally. Humans are the natural host. Now, there are three stages of syphilis. So there's primary, secondary, tertiary, each characterized by different symptoms. And the symptoms reflect the location of the bacterium. So it starts off first with the primary stage, and the major symptom here is a canker that will last up to anywhere from 7 to 10 days. So the spirochete will bind to the epithelial cells, multiply, and form this sore, and the fluid that drains from the canker is highly contagious. Now, this canker will heal, and then the spirochete will move into the blood. So once it's in the blood, then we have secondary syphilis, which is characterized by this rash on the skin, palms, and soles, with also an accompanied fever, headache, sore throat, and the rash will disappear spontaneously, transitioning into tertiary phase of syphilis if left untreated, where you have damage to multiple tissues and organs, and characteristic symptom are these soft tissue ulcerations called gummas. Now, there are cases where Treponema pallidum can pass through the placenta to the fetus, and these symptoms include nasal discharge, skin eruptions, bone deformation, and also neurological or nervous system abnormalities. So there are serological tests, fluorescent tests that can be done to test for the presence of this pathogen, and it's important to note here that because at each stage you're seeing different symptoms, these stages can mimic other diseases. So very important to test for the actual antigen of Treponema pallidum, and these infections can be treated with penicillins. Next is Leptospira. So two species here, Biflexa. The first does not cause disease. It's a free-living saprobe. And Interrogans is the pathogenic one. It's a zoonotic pathogen causing the disease known as leptospirosis. So this is one to remember that is transmitted from contact with contaminated animal urine. So the bacteria is shed in the urine and infection occurs through contact. It will then target the kidneys, liver, brain, potentially the eyes, and symptoms: sudden high fever, chills, headache, muscle aches, conjunctivitis, vomiting. Only about 50 to 60 cases per year, and long-term infections may target the kidneys and liver. On to Borrelia. So two that are worthy to note here. Borrelia species are transmitted via an insect vector, and these are larger than the others that I've mentioned thus far. So there's Borrelia hermsii and Borrelia burgdorferi. In the case of Borrelia hermsii, this causes a relapsing fever. So it's characterized by this oscillatory nature of a fever pattern, and essentially the relapsing fever pattern is reflective of changes in the antigenic challenge. So you have this first stage of fever, primary infection will induce a high fever in a host. As the host adapts and produces antibodies, the pathogen will then present a second antigen. and it continues to do this a few times until after 3 antigen presentations, then it is variable. So as far as relapsing fever, the reservoirs for Borrelia hermsii are squirrels, chipmunks, and it is transmitted via ticks. So again, there's this oscillatory fever pattern. There's anywhere from a 2-day to 2-week incubation period. Patients usually have high fever, shaking, chills, headache, fatigue, similar to the flu, but also potentially vomiting, abdominal pain, and damage to the liver, spleen, heart, kidneys, and also the nerves. And so remember that oscillating fever pattern is reflective of the immune system producing antibodies and then resulting in recurrent relapses as the antigens change. So this infection also, I should note, is treated with tetracycline. And then we have another Borrelia species, Burgdorferi. So this is the causative agent of Lyme's disease. And this pathogen exhibits this complex life cycle involving multiple hosts, so mice, deer, and it is transmitted via the tick. So the tick will bite the human host, and the human acts as an accidental host. So it's worthy to note here that it is the nymph stage of the tick's life. So this would be in the 2nd year that it enters this aggressive feeding stage, and that is when humans can become infected with this particular pathogen. Now, this disease is non-fatal, but it is a slowly progressive syndrome that can mimic neuromuscular and rheumatoid arthritic conditions. We've been seeing recently a lot of patients that have Lyme's disease are presenting with this post-Lyme's disease syndrome. So even people who have taken antibiotics and have recovered, as far as the test showing no presence of this bacterium at all in their blood, it still seems that they have arthritic symptoms. So there's a lot to still learn about this pathogen, whether that there's irreversible damage that's caused or whether this pathogen may lie dormant. But very important to get diagnosed and treated because it can progress to cardiac and neurological symptoms and painful arthritic conditions. Now, it's thought that a lot of people get the rash, but statistically 50 to 70% of patients will show this characteristic bullseye rash. Also fever, headache, stiff neck, and dizziness, and it's treated with tetracycline or amoxicillin. All right, on to from the spirochetes to the curviform bacteria. So 3 genera here that cause enteric diseases: Vibrio, Campylobacter, and Helicobacter. So Vibrio cholera is the causative agent of cholera, and this particular pathogen is contracted from ingesting contaminated food or water. So mostly in underdeveloped countries where there's not great access to healthy, clean water. This biotype L-Tor seems to be the most highly virulent or highly pathogenic. It survives longer and is more infectious. And as far as the pathology of this particular microbe, it will infect the mucous membrane of the small intestinal tract. And the most important virulence factor here is the cholera toxin. So the cholera toxin will essentially initiate the release of ions, electrolytes, and water from intestinal epithelial cells, causing severe dehydration, leading to muscle, circulatory, and neurological symptoms. And there's this characteristic symptom here of rice water stool. So as far as treatment schemes, oral rehydration therapy, tetracycline, and again, the cholera toxin, just to go over the mechanism here. So you're seeing a picture of all of the electrolytes and water leaving the intestinal cells. Now, the mechanism here, if you take a look, so here's the bacterium, here's the cholera toxin. The toxin will actually activate this enzyme called adenyl cyclase. When it activates this enzyme, you have an increase in the amount of cyclic AMP, and the CAMP will cause the release of electrolytes and water from intestinal epithelial cells. So this causes that secretory diarrhea and dehydration. Now, a couple other Vibrio-associated pathogens, and we even see cases of this along the shore here in Connecticut. These are associated with contaminated seafood, especially oysters. So Vibrio parahemolyticus causes gastroenteritis, symptoms similar to cholera, and vulnificus, same thing from raw oysters. Serious complications associated with this pathogen are seen in people with diabetic or liver conditions. And the treatment is, again, oral rehydration, electrolyte therapy, and occasionally antibiotics. Moving on to Campylobacter. So Campylobacter can be seen existing as the Vibrio-shaped, spiral, or the S-shaped, or even in pairs. And this is a common resident of the intestines, genitourinary tract, also the oral cavity of birds and mammals. So the one that I'll focus in on here is jejuni. So jejuni is an important cause of bacterial gastroenteritis. It is transmitted by contaminated beverages and food, specifically raw beef. This particular pathogen will reach the mucosa at the last segment of the small intestine near the colon, so the jejunum. It will attach, adhere, burrow through the mucus, and multiply. And similar to cholera, here we have another toxin. It's called CJT toxin that will stimulate a secretory diarrhea like that seen in cholera. Now, symptoms: headache, fever, abdominal pain, bloody or watery diarrhea. And treatment would be oral rehydration therapy and electrolyte restoration. And then last out of this group is Helicobacter pylori. So years ago it was thought that lifestyle choices, for example, smoking, consumption of alcohol, eating spicy foods, or a stressful lifestyle caused stomach ulcers, but now we know that it's actually an infectious disease. So stomach ulcers are caused by Helicobacter pylori, and the scientists that discovered this infectious disease and this microbe in particular convinced the medical community that it caused a stomach ulcer by swallowing a saturated culture of this pathogen, and he indeed developed an ulcer. So what we know now is that it causes 90% of stomach and duodenal ulcers, and also it seems to predispose individuals to stomach cancer. People with type O blood have 1.5 to 2 times higher rate of developing an ulcer, and the most important virulence factor here is an enzyme called urease, which converts urea into ammonium and bicarbonate. Now, a few others to mention here. So 3 atypical groups of bacterial pathogens: the rickettsias, chlamydias, and the mycoplasmas. So rickettsias, similar to viruses, they're small obligate intracellular parasites. They were actually previously thought to be a virus, but they are just very teeny bacterial cells. They're non-motile, and they're pleomorphic rods or coccobacilli. And insects are involved in their life cycle. So arthropod transmitted diseases, we'll see ticks, fleas, and lice. And the bacteria will enter the endothelial cells, causing necrosis of the vascular lining, resulting in vasculitis, vascular leakage, and thrombosis. So a few different diseases here. Prowazeki is the species associated with epidemic typhus, and this seems to be transmitted via the louse. Symptoms start with high fever, chills, headache, and a rash. Then we have endemic typhus caused by Rickettsia typhi or typhi. This is spread via the flea. More mild symptoms here. And then Rickettsia rickettsii, causative agent of Rocky Mountain spotted fever. This is characterized by a distinct spotted rash, and this pathogen may progress as far as the pathology to damage the heart and the CNS. Also, a related genus, Ehrlichia, contains 2 species of rickettsias, and these are transmitted via the tick. So for Rocky Mountain spotted fever, first symptoms are fever, chills, headache, and that spotted rash will appear within a few days. And as mentioned before, the CNS can become involved, and fatality rates approach 20% if left untreated. Another pathogen to mention here, Bartonella. So Bartonella henselae is the causative agent of cat scratch disease, and this is a lymphatic infection associated with a claw injury by a cat. And as far as Bartonella, they are small, similar to rickettsias, and this cat scratch disease seems to be more severe in the later stage HIV infected or chronic AIDS patients. So moving on to chlamydia. So chlamydia trachomatis is responsible for causing trachoma, inclusion conjunctivitis, and a very common sexually transmitted disease. So in ocular trachoma, this is associated with deformation of the eyelid, as seen on the bottom left-hand image here, and the cornea may result in blindness. And then inclusion conjunctivitis, we see on the lower right, occurs as the baby passes through the birth canal, and this can be prevented by prophylactic creams. And then also, chlamydia trachomatis is the causative agent of the second most prevalent STD, resulting in urethritis, cervicitis, if there's co-infection with gonorrhea, pelvic inflammatory disease, and possibly infertility and scarring. Now, another one to mention, lymphogranuloma venereum can cause a disfiguring disease of the external genitalia and pelvic lymphatics, as we see on the bottom here. And trachoma, so this is just a broad term referring to the ability of this pathogen to attack the mucous membranes in the eyes, genitourinary tract, as we saw here, but then also the lungs as well. And then related to chlamydias are the chlamydophila. So these used to belong to the chlamydia genus, but now based on sequencing, they have been placed in their own genus of the bacterial world. So Chlamydophila pneumoniae causes an atypical pneumonia that is more serious in asthma patients. And then Chlamydophila psittaci causes ornithosis. This is a zoonotic disease transmitted from birds, and it's highly communicable among all birds, associated with a lower respiratory pneumonia or flu-like infection with fever as well. And then the mycoplasma. So please remember, this is the one genus that naturally lacks a cell wall, and because of this, it is highly pleomorphic. So Mycoplasma pneumoniae is the causative agent of primary atypical pneumonia, and pneumonia associated with fever, chest pain, and sore throat. And it's worthy to note here that, so Mycoplasma is the one genus that naturally does not have a cell wall, but there are bacteria that can be induced to lose their cell wall from either exposure to antimicrobials or enzymes, and these would be referred to as an L form or the L phase of that cell. Some that we've seen that display this loss of their cell wall, the group A strep, Proteus, Corynebacterium, Mycobacterium, those all we've seen characteristically, but even staph bacteria, for example, or other genera can spontaneously lose their cell wall. And then lastly, the group of bacteria that are associated with the oral cavity and the formation of dental cavities and periodontal disease. So everyone's ecosystem, as far as the microbes that live within your mouth, are more highly diverse than even your gut. So it's a very complex, dynamic environment, and essentially there are bacteria that thrive within the oral cavity that can lay the framework of the groundwork for the formation of what's called a pellicle, which then will lead to the formation of a biofilm, which we call common name plaque. Once the plaque forms, then you have acids that are produced from the colonizing bacteria that will eat away at the enamel and also cause gums disease and bleeding of the gums, and eventually, if not treated, tooth loss. So the steps here involved in how a cavity actually forms starts off with that first layer of bacteria, and usually it's streptococcal bacteria. So Streptococcus mutans is the causative agent of a dental cavity. Once this adheres to the tooth, then actinomyces colonize, and it starts to form this thick biofilm layer that we call plaque. So then the bacteria will produce acids that eat away at the enamel of the teeth, and if the plaque is allowed to stay, then you have future colonization with all different types of genre of bacteria: Lactobacillus, Bacteroides, Fusobacterium, Treponema, Porphyromonas, and this just perpetuates the eating away at the enamel and the formation of dental caries. So again, this is this process that I just mentioned, the groundwork of the first layer of strep and cross-adhered with actinomyces. So this is the pellicle, and then we have the biofilm that builds up and causes the release of acids. And when the formation of that biofilm and the plaque becomes calcified above and below the gingiva, so in between the teeth, this will irritate the gums, causing inflammation. And the medical term for this is gingivitis. So the pockets actually between the tooth and the gingiva can then be invaded by pathogenic bacteria, spirochetes, and gram-negative bacilli, and the tooth socket may be involved. So this is called periodontitis. And periodontal disease is a nasty condition once it gets to a stage where you have receding gums, because once this gum is lost, this is irreversible damage. And if it goes down to the root of the tooth may be lost. And also in severe cases, this may require grafting of gum tissue from the roof of the mouth to the base of the tooth. So that concludes chapter 21, and this also concludes all of the chapters on bacterial pathogens. So please don't forget, next week you guys have exam 3 on chapters 18 through 21, and I will see you next week.